A flight attendant disrespected a black teen's puppy mid-flight, but he had no idea the father was watching, and the consequences that followed left the entire cabin stunned. A flight attendant kicked a black teen's puppy during the flight. Thinking the cruelty would go unnoticed, he didn't realize the boy's father was watching, a man known for ending injustice with his bare hands. The moment that puppy cried, the entire cabin shifted. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses, the second real strength stands up. A sharp whimper cut through the quiet hum of Velmor SkyFlight 772 just as the aircraft leveled out above the clouds. It wasn't loud enough to draw alarm, but noticeable, like the sound of something small reacting to something wrong. Dorran Kess didn't even flinch as he passed the second row, but his eyes flicked down and locked onto the small brown puppy nestled in the lap of a teenage boy. His jaw tightened. A cold glare followed. Then he walked on. Jaren Hale, 14, flinched slightly as he felt the weight of that stare. He instinctively pulled his arms around the tiny creature tighter. "It's okay, Miko," he whispered into the puppy's soft fur, his voice a mixture of comfort and worry. Miko, a recent addition to the family after months of allowance-saving and volunteer hours at the local shelter, trembled gently in his custom harness. His eyes were wide, glossy with confusion, perhaps sensing something more than just the altitude shift. The boy glanced at his father beside him, hoping for reassurance. Dr. Jaren Hale didn't look up immediately. His eyes were focused on the tablet in front of him, scrolling through encrypted presentation slides related to a major cybersecurity briefing set to happen in Eldoria Port the next morning. But then, as if sensing something shift in the air, he lifted his head just in time to catch the tail end of Dorran Kess's gaze and the cold detachment within it. Jaren studied the flight attendant's retreating figure for a moment. Rigid spine, measured, clipped steps, every movement purposeful, precise, but not in a professional way. There was something else, not just routine, not just the ordinary, polished cadence of someone who had recited safety briefings hundreds of times. This was personal, calculated, cold. "Did something happen?" Jaren asked quietly, his voice low and steady. Jaren hesitated. "I think he didn't like Miko." Jaren leaned back, scanning the cabin subtly. Passengers were settling in, some flipping open books, others adjusting headrests or fiddling with entertainment screens. The seatbelt sign had just blinked off, and the familiar sterile calm of cruising altitude was beginning to settle. But that whimper still echoed in the back of Jaren's mind. "He didn't say anything?" Jaren pressed gently. "No, just looked," Jaren said, stroking Miko's ears, "like he wanted him gone." Jaren said nothing at first, but his hand moved to his armrest where his smartwatch sat idle. He tapped the screen once, waking the interface, then let it go dark again. A reflex. Quiet preparation, just in case. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, giving the cabin a soft, amber tone. The hum of the engines blended with the occasional rattle from the service galley. Somewhere a few rows back, a man coughed. Another window shutter clicked shut. Everything about the flight screamed routine, but Jaren still held Miko a little too tight, and Dorran Kess passed by a second time, this time without even glancing at them, which somehow felt more deliberate. Jaren turned slightly in his seat, tracking the attendant's movement in the reflection of the cabin window. Dorran was heading toward the rear, speaking to another crew member with hushed gestures. Not angry, not loud, but his posture, always that same stiff rigidity, like a coiled wire under tension, never softened. Jaren's small voice returned. "Do you think he's going to say, 'I can't have Miko here'?" "No," Jaren said calmly. "You followed all the guidelines. Harnessed, registered, cleared. But what if?" "He doesn't decide that," Jaren cut in, firm but gentle. "And we didn't come on this flight to defend what's already been approved. Let him look." Jaren nodded, but his shoulders stayed tense. Miko shifted, burying his head under the boy's arm as if choosing the safest cave in the sky. Senrik glanced again toward the rear. Dorran had disappeared behind the service curtain. A murmur of conversation between attendants floated faintly up the aisle. The mood remained falsely calm. Back at their row, Jaren adjusted Miko's blanket. "I was going to show him the clouds," he said, "when we got higher, like last time." Senrik smiled faintly. "Still can. He'll like that." Outside, the world had disappeared into streaks of deep blue and gold, the last rays of the setting sun casting a molten hue over the wing. Below them was nothing but night. Then Dorran returned. He didn't speak. He didn't pause. He simply passed, pushing a service cart slowly, almost deliberately. As he neared their row, Miko shifted again, letting out another quiet whimper. And again Dorran's eyes flicked down. A heartbeat too long. Senrik saw it clearly this time. The look was not one of standard annoyance. Not the weary frown of a man who disliked dogs. It was sharper, meaner. It was the kind of look that didn't need words. A threat dressed in silence. "Did he do anything?" Senrik asked softly after Dorran had passed. "No," Jaren said, "but he looked like he might." Senrik didn't answer right away. He reached for the small notepad tucked in the seat pocket and slowly wrote something with a stylus. Row 2. Dorran Kess. Watch movement. Record timing. No escalation unless provoked. Then he ripped the page clean, folded it once, and slid it into his coat pocket. The plane continued its smooth path through the sky. The engines whispered like distant drums. The passengers, bathed in artificial gold, reclined in comfort. A steward in the back made a quiet joke that no one up front could hear, and in the middle of it all, a man sat perfectly still beside his son, silently preparing for a conflict he hoped would never come. But it was already walking the aisle, and no one had realized it yet. The bark was sharp, short, high-pitched, accidental. Jaren's eyes widened as Miko startled at the sudden mechanical groan of the overhead air vents and let out a bark no louder than a cough. The boy instinctively hushed him, cradling the small brown puppy closer to his chest. A few nearby passengers looked up, but most simply smiled and returned to their books, earbuds, or half-finished meals. But not Dorran Kess. The flight attendant spun around like a string had been yanked in his spine. His jaw locked, shoulders squared, and his eyes, those thin slivers of disapproval, zeroed in on Jaren like a targeting system. "Control that thing," Dorran snapped. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the hush of the cabin with a cold edge that turned heads. The forced smile he plastered on his face as he caught sight of Senrik looking up from his tablet did little to hide the venom behind the words. Jaren blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, his arms gently swaddling Miko as if shielding him from more than turbulence. Dorran gave a stiff nod, the kind meant to look official, but it lacked sincerity. His lips curled ever so slightly as he turned away and resumed checking the overhead bins, but his muttering was audible to those nearest. Senrik set his tablet down without closing the encryption app. His fingers hovered above the surface for a moment, then folded together. He glanced at Jaren, who was now gently stroking Miko's ear with trembling fingers. The boy looked down, embarrassed, not by the bark but by the attention it had drawn. Senrik didn't say anything. Not yet. He leaned back slowly and watched Dorran's retreating figure. There was something unsettling in that man's energy, not just irritation or professional fatigue. It was something darker, something controlled, something that looked for opportunities. The aircraft shifted as it passed through a shallow pocket of turbulence. Trays rattled, glasses clinked faintly, and Jaren reflexively tightened his grip as Miko startled again, kicking out with one small leg and tapping the underside of the seat. The action was harmless, barely perceptible, but it caught Dorran's attention again. He turned his head. The look he gave wasn't just annoyance this time. It lingered. Dorran's eyes narrowed into slits, his jaw twitching with restraint. His hands, clenched at his sides, relaxed only as he rolled his neck once and resumed walking. Jaren didn't see it. He was busy whispering to Miko. Senrik did. He tracked every movement. The rigid stride, the clenched posture, the too long glare, and then the fake casualness as Dorran stopped to adjust a galley drawer on the opposite side of the cabin, never taking his eyes off the Hale's row. Senrik inhaled slowly, then exhaled even slower. He had trained his entire professional life to stay composed under pressure, boardroom collapses, cybersecurity breaches, high-stakes negotiations, but something about this wasn't about business. It was personal, deliberate. And as he looked at his son, gently soothing a scared animal, something else began to settle inside him. Not fear, not anger, a preparation. Dorran passed again minutes later, this time without speaking, but his walk was slow, calculated. His eyes didn't move toward any other row, only theirs. And Jaren, still trying to be respectful, still thinking politeness was a shield, didn't speak. He just offered a small apologetic smile that was met with silence. The boy shifted in his seat and looked out the window, blinking quickly to hide frustration. He thought the apology had worked before. Now he wasn't sure. Miko whimpered softly, burrowing against Jaren's hoodie. Senrik tilted his wrist slightly and tapped his smartwatch, logging a brief voice memo into his secure personal file. Nothing too direct, just a note. Cabin staff. Antagonistic tone. Passive hostility toward seat 19A. The tension didn't explode. Not yet, but it vibrated through the silence like pressure behind a sealed valve. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced up and frowned as Dorran walked by with unusually rigid posture. Behind him, a teenage student raised an eyebrow but said nothing. No one intervened, but many noticed. And that noticing, quiet as it was, laid the foundation for what would follow. Senrik's gaze remained locked on Dorran's back. He knew a simple truth. Malice in uniform doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. And right now, it was waiting for something small enough to twist into justification. Jaren looked at his father. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked in a whisper, his voice cracking slightly. Senrik shook his head slowly. "No," he said, reaching over and placing a firm hand on Jaren's shoulder. "You're doing exactly right." He meant it, but deep inside, he could feel the storm gathering at the edge of that calm. In the stillness of the cabin, something dark was preparing to break. Dorran Kess stopped at their row, trays in hand, but made no move to distribute them. Instead, he stood still, towering slightly, his eyes fixed on the small brown puppy curled tightly in Jaren Hale's lap. The boy looked up with polite confusion, sensing something off. Miko wore his soft, airline-approved safety harness, barely taking up space, quietly nestled like a warm cushion beneath Jaren's clasped hands. "Excuse me, sir," Jaren said gently. "Could I hold on to the meal tray without moving Miko? He's sleeping, and I don't want to startle him." Dorran's lips pressed into a line. "The animal is obstructing the service path," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear but quiet enough to pass as official conduct. His tone wore a thin mask of courtesy, but his irritation glinted behind every word. Senrik, seated beside his son, looked up calmly from his tablet. His eyes briefly locked with Dorran's, measured, unreadable. "I can hold both trays, if that helps," he offered, reaching out with a steady hand. Dorran's expression twitched. Something darker passed through it, like disdain wearing the uniform of professionalism. Still, he nodded once and began placing the trays, though his hands moved a little too quickly, a little too close to Jaren's side. Then, with a motion too casual to be natural, he, accidentally, let a napkin fall from one tray, letting it drift just beneath Miko's paws. "I'll get that," he muttered. Jaren instinctively leaned back to avoid disturbing the tray placement, but Dorran was already crouching. With theatrical care, he reached under the seat and pressed his polished black shoe directly into Miko's ribs. The contact was deliberate, small, calculated, and cruel. Miko let out a sharp whimper, jerking in pain. Jaren froze, the tray shaking in his grip. His eyes widened, not just in fear, but in confusion, trying to register what just happened. His hands moved instinctively to hold Miko close, protectively curling over the trembling body. Senric's face changed. He didn't speak. He didn't rise. He didn't reach. But something behind his eyes sharpened, a flicker of ice, not fire. The quiet fury of a man who saw what others didn't. "Is there a problem?" Senric asked, his tone controlled like a sealed vault. Dorran straightened slowly, brushing invisible dust from his pant leg. "Turbulence startled the animal," he said flatly, glancing toward the overhead light as if blaming the cabin's rhythm. He then looked to the surrounding passengers, who had seen nothing more than a flinch and a whimper, their expressions unreadable. Jaren's voice came out small. "Dad." Senric turned to his son, gently touching his shoulder. "It's okay, Jaren," he said softly. "Let's keep calm." Jaren nodded, but his hands trembled as he comforted Miko. His young mind struggled to balance obedience with outrage, to decide whether it was right to cry out or stay polite. He looked back at Dorran, whose mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a scowl. The air inside the cabin seemed thicker now, humming with something invisible. Just then, the plane gave a sudden dip, barely a shake, but enough to jostle drink cups and unsettle stomachs. Dorran used it like a script handed to him. He clutched the nearest seat for show, shook his head as if burdened by chaos, and muttered, "Exactly why animals shouldn't be in the air." His voice wasn't directed at anyone, yet it was loud enough for a nearby businessman to glance over. Senric's hand tightened over the armrest. He didn't stand. Not yet. But his every sense locked in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't about pet regulations or personal preference anymore. It was a calculated targeting of something innocent. The professional mask that Dorran wore had begun to crack, and what showed through wasn't merely dislike. It was malice looking for cover. Jaren didn't speak again, but he lowered his head and pressed his cheek to Miko's soft fur, breathing slowly. Miko's body still shivered. The boy whispered something soundless, more comfort for himself than the dog. In the row behind them, a man cleared his throat. A subtle movement, maybe just adjusting his phone camera. No one seemed to notice. Senric sat still, but inside his mind, the calculus was already shifting. This wasn't just a father-son trip anymore. This was now a threat, quiet and smiling, wearing navy epaulets and polished shoes. A threat disguised as routine. Dorran took a step back and turned without another word, walking down the aisle with his service cart. His posture remained straight, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his gait, as if he believed no one had seen what he'd done. He was wrong. Senric's eyes remained on his back until he disappeared behind the curtain. Jaren didn't ask for help. He didn't want to cry, but he kept petting Miko with a shaking hand, trying to convince himself that everything would be okay. The plane hummed, steady and cold, and high above the world, in a cabin full of passengers who still thought this was just another quiet flight, the real turbulence was already alive and moving. The conflict had stepped out of the shadows and into their row. Dorran Kess crouched low beside the seat, his voice smooth but his movement sharp. "Just a quick safety check," he said, flashing a forced smile that didn't touch his eyes. The words were for the passengers nearby, but his real focus was narrow and venomous. His hand hovered near the edge of the seat as if inspecting for some technical hazard, but his eyes were fixed squarely on the small brown puppy nestled between Jaren Hale's arms. Jaren's grip tightened protectively around Miko. The boy's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear alone but from the confusing blend of confusion, shame, and dread that only children understand when they know something is wrong, but no one is helping. Jaren Hale sat silent beside them, expression calm but alert. The smartwatch on his wrist was already recording. Subtle, efficient, capturing every breath and footstep in digital clarity. He watched without blinking. Then it happened again. Dorran's elbow jerked slightly as his leg shifted, and with more force than the last time, he jabbed his knee against the underside of the seat. The sharp nudge struck Miko directly. The puppy yelped in pain, a thin, startled sound that pierced the soft hum of the cabin. The noise sliced through conversations and snores like a snapped wire. Heads turned. "Oh, turbulence," Dorran announced too quickly, rising to his full height and brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. "Everyone stay seated." But Senrik had seen it. So had Jaren. So had the man 2 rows back, Edrin Vale, who had raised his phone just moments before and now held it steady, unmoving, lens pointed forward like a witness that could not be silenced. From where he sat, he had a clear angle, and what he'd seen could not be mistaken for turbulence. Jaren's eyes welled. He blinked hard, fighting it, but the tears came anyway. His voice cracked as he whispered to Miko, who trembled now without pause, burying his nose into the crook of Jaren's elbow. Senrik's voice was low but sharp as flint. "That's enough. Stop bothering my son." Dorran turned. His expression changed, no longer feigning professionalism. There was a twitch in his cheek, a tightening at the corner of his jaw. He stepped forward slowly, hands on his hips, as if daring Senrik to say more. "You're bringing chaos into a controlled environment," Dorran said, his tone laced with contempt. "Animals don't belong in the air." The air around them went still. The ambient sounds of the plane, the ventilation hum, the occasional cough, the shuffle of plastic meal trays seemed to dim. The words hung there, heavy and full of meaning. Every man nearby paused, caught in that fragile moment between ignorance and consequence. Jaren flinched. He didn't understand all the implications, but he understood the look on Dorran's face. It was a look that wanted to hurt something small. Senrik rose slightly in his seat, not aggressive, but no longer passive either. "He's registered, approved, and none of this is part of any safety protocol." Dorran didn't respond. Instead, he took one step closer, violating personal space. A slow, intentional motion that made it clear this wasn't about safety. This was about control. Then the aircraft stilled. The last bump of turbulence had passed. The aisle was momentarily empty. The opportunity had come, and Dorran took it. He turned his body slightly, pivoted on his heel, and with calculated force drove the side of his shoe into the frame of the seat, right where Miko had curled to hide. The metal echoed with the impact. The yelp that followed was sharper than before, not just pain, but terror. Gasps erupted around them. One passenger half stood. Another cursed under his breath. Several phones were already lifted, uncertain if what they just saw was real. Jaren screamed. Not words, just sound. Raw and full of helplessness. Senrik stood now, full height, broad-shouldered and quiet as a storm about to break. He didn't move yet, but his eyes were locked on Dorran's. Behind them, somewhere deeper, something was shifting. Not just anger, purpose. And still, Dorran stood tall, his expression unreadable, but no longer innocent. The recording continued from Senrik's wrist. The footage from Edrin's phone captured the angle, and though no one had touched Dorran, he looked ready to play the victim. But it was too late for illusion now. The line between tension and violence had finally been crossed. In a movement so deliberate it defied any excuse of clumsiness, he drove his heel into the side of the small brown puppy curled beside Jaren's leg. The impact sent Miko tumbling, his tiny body striking the exposed metal frame of the seat with a sickening clank. The sound cut through the soft hum of the engines like a siren. Gasps fluttered from nearby rows. Jaren's scream erupted before the pain even fully registered in Miko's body. "Miko!" the boy cried out, lurching forward, arms outstretched in instinct. The puppy hit the floor, whimpered once, then went still. Senrik was already rising before Jaren could reach him. The rattle of his seatback slamming into its locked position was lost beneath the chaos unfolding in row 16. His calm, the calculated stillness that had defined his presence since boarding, shattered, not into recklessness, but something colder, focused, absolute. He stepped into the aisle. All around them, passengers twisted in their seats, eyes wide, uncertain whether to intervene or stay still. Jaren Hale's phone was up before anyone else moved, recording with the practiced calm of someone who knew truth needed witnesses. Dorran stepped back, lifting both hands in mock surrender. "I tripped," he barked. "It was an accident." But no one was buying it. Not after the glares, not after the muttered complaints, not after the way he had lingered just moments earlier with tension curled in his jaw like a cocked spring. The man had wanted this, or at least welcomed the opportunity. Jaren was kneeling on the cabin floor now, tears streaking his face as he scooped up the trembling puppy. Miko's breaths were shallow, each one a struggle. The safety harness had snapped during the fall, now hanging limply from his side. Senric's fists clenched at his sides. He moved toward Dorran, slow and deliberate. Not rushing, not raising his voice, but the intensity in his eyes was undeniable. Quiet, simmering wrath beneath a polished surface. "Back up," Senric said, voice low but sharp as a scalpel. Dorran held his ground, trying to recover the illusion of control. "Sir, you're—" Senric grabbed him. One hand closed on the collar of Dorran's uniform vest, pulling him forward until their faces were inches apart. The cabin lights flickered slightly as turbulence stirred the plane again, but Senric's grip remained steady. "You're going to regret every second of what you just did," he said, his words delivered with unnerving calm. "And if you touch my son or his dog again, you won't leave this flight on your feet." Dorran's face reddened, not with shame, but fury. He twisted slightly in the grip, lips curling as if ready to lash back, but then his eyes darted past Senric's shoulder. They landed on the intercom panel, glowing faintly beside the galley bulkhead. Without warning, Dorran lunged sideways, slipping from Senric's hold. His fingers slammed against the call button near the panel. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the overhead click of the speaker activation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dorran began, voice now loud, trembling with false authority. "We're experiencing a situation with an unstable passenger in row 16. I need immediate—" He didn't finish. Senric reached across the aisle and slammed his hand down on the lower reset panel beneath the comm unit. The speaker crackled and died. Silence fell again, interrupted only by Miko's shallow breaths and the hum of the engines. "You're not hijacking the truth," Senric muttered under his breath. Jaren sobbed behind him, clutching Miko like he was cradling something far more fragile than a puppy, something like innocence itself. Around them, the atmosphere was no longer uncertain. The passengers had seen it, felt it. Their expressions no longer asked what happened. They now asked, what happens next? Dorran stepped back into the galley space, breathing hard. His hands trembled. The illusion of professionalism was gone. Now he looked like what he truly was, cornered, exposed, and dangerously reactive. Senric stood in the aisle like a wall between Dorran and his son. "Sit down," Dorran suddenly snapped, trying to reclaim power. "You've assaulted a crew member and endangered this flight." No one moved. That was when Jaren Hale stood, raising his voice just enough to be heard by everyone around. "We saw what you did," he said, tone calm, even. "It's all on video." A ripple of tension passed through the cabin. The tide had turned. But Dorran wasn't finished. His hand hovered again near the intercom switch and his posture changed, shoulders tensing, stance widening like he was bracing for something. The threat was no longer hidden in cold glances or muttered complaints. It was now active, escalating. Senric didn't step back. He breathed in once, then shifted his feet. Years ago, in a different life, he had trained with crisis containment units, cyber threats, physical threats, psychological manipulation. He had learned one principle above all: Timing is everything. Jaren whimpered softly behind him. Dad, Miko's still breathing. Barely. The words cut through the moment like a razor. Senric's fury didn't boil. It crystallized. He raised a hand, but not in violence. He simply pointed at Dorran and then at the passenger witnesses. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." But the twist came sharply. Dorran, sensing the unraveling of his control, slapped the side of the intercom again, this time reaching not for the public address but for the emergency alert button wired directly to ground control. A small red LED lit up. A silent alarm had been triggered. He'd called for intervention, but the lie he told would reach the ground first unless someone could stop it. Senric's eyes narrowed. The flight had just become a battlefield of truth versus narrative, and the clock was now ticking. The moment the puppy hit the metal frame, the entire flight changed forever. Chaos erupted the moment Dorran Kess's foot struck Miko. The soft yelp of the puppy still echoed in the air as passengers shot up in alarm, voices rising in overlapping cries. Phones were drawn instantly, lenses locking onto the narrow aisle like eyes of judgment. From behind the meal carts and tucked between tray tables, gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers turned the once quiet cabin into a maelstrom of disbelief. Backpedaling quickly, Dorran staggered toward the galley, panic flashing across his face. His hand shot out, slapping the intercom panel as though grasping for a lifeline. His voice trembled, the pitch swinging between anger and desperation. "This passenger, he assaulted me," he shouted, gesturing wildly toward Jaren Hale. The lie twisted in the air, thick and brittle. Those seated within earshot stiffened, jaws clenching, not out of confusion, but indignation. They had seen the truth. So had their cameras. Senric didn't rush. He didn't shout. He stepped forward, deliberate and calm as if cutting through fog. There was no fire in his eyes, just a quiet, frightening clarity. His hand reached the intercom base and, with a single firm press, disabled the broadcast. The button, recessed and obscure, was a hidden reset only someone with technical understanding would know to touch. The cabin's speakers fell silent. Jaren was curled in his seat, his fingers wrapped tightly around Miko's trembling body. The boy's shoulders shook. Tears wet his cheeks and his lips moved in quiet, broken apologies whispered to his injured companion. Miko's breathing had slowed to a troubling rhythm, shallow, staggered. Seeing his son in that state fractured something deep in Senric, but he held it together, every muscle in his body tight with restraint. "Everyone stay calm," Senric said, voice low but firm, cutting through the panic like a stabilizing cord. "Please do not move from your seats. We are going to handle this." His tone carried no question, only assurance, and strangely, it worked. The shouting eased, eyes locked on him now, waiting. But Dorran wasn't done. Trapped and exposed, he reached down and grabbed a metal catering tray. His grip was white-knuckled. The tremor in his hands betrayed the panic beneath his bravado. He lifted it like a weapon, angling it slightly as if gauging weight, eyes darting from Senric to the surrounding passengers, like a man on the edge of a cliff, ready to make a final, desperate move. Before the scene could unravel further, the cockpit door hissed open with a subtle click. First Officer Malrin Thale stepped out. His presence changed the air. Tall, composed, and with a military posture earned from years in aviation, Malrin surveyed the situation without a word at first. His gaze cut from Dorran's raised tray to Senric's steady stance and down to the sobbing boy cradling the wounded puppy. "What's happening here?" Malrin asked, voice sharp but controlled. Dorran turned to him immediately, seizing the moment. "This passenger attacked me. He endangered crew safety. He threatened me." Malrin didn't nod. He didn't move. Instead, he looked around the cabin slowly. Every set of eyes a witness. Dozens of phones held high. The weight of silence returned, but it wasn't confusion now. It was truth waiting to be recognized. "I see," Malrin said after a beat, his expression unreadable. Is that what happened? His voice didn't rise, but in it lay a quiet suspicion, the kind that disarmed liars. Senrik didn't step forward this time. He simply remained where he stood, in front of Jaren, one hand lightly resting on the back of the seat beside him. "First officer," he said, meeting Malren's eyes. "The intercom was being misused. The video recordings can confirm everything. He kicked my son's dog. Twice." Dorran scoffed, still clutching the tray like a shield. "The dog was aggressive." "He's 14 weeks old," Senrik said, voice still level but with a new edge. "The only thing he's ever attacked is a sock." From behind, a soft metallic click rang out, a phone being returned to a pocket. A man from row 12 stood slightly raising his hand. Edrin Vale. Calm, expression serious. "It's all recorded. I've uploaded it to the cloud already. Time stamped, multiple angles. I'll provide my statement to ground control." Malren blinked once. That was all he needed. The shift in crew dynamics was subtle, but irreversible. Malren's gaze narrowed slightly as he turned back to Dorran, the tray still hovering in midair. "Put that down," he said. Dorran hesitated, then slowly lowered the tray. The room exhaled. Senrik remained where he was, unmoving. Every breath he took was a battle to remain composed, for his son, for the truth, and for the justice that had begun to take shape. Jaren clutched Miko tighter, burying his face in the soft fur, muffling his sobs. Around them, passengers sat frozen in a strange blend of fear and relief, witnesses to something they would never forget. Malren took one step closer to Dorran, quietly pressing the sidewall comm override switch, disabling any more false broadcasts. The flight was still miles from landing, but the direction of power had already changed hands. The cabin had turned into a battlefield where truth and lies fought for space. Dorran lunged with the metal tray, swinging it in a wide arc aimed directly at Senrik Hale's head. Without hesitation, Senrik's right hand shot upward, intercepting the tray mid-swing. The sharp metallic clang of the impact echoed down the aisle. Passengers gasped, their breath catching in a single collective inhale. But Senrik didn't flinch. His grip tightened around the tray's edge with calm force, his expression cold and unreadable. He didn't look like a man reacting out of panic. He looked like someone trained to end chaos before it spread. Dorran stumbled back, caught off guard by the sheer control in Senrik's movements. "Let go of me," he spat, eyes darting around for support. But Senrik didn't speak. He released the tray, letting it fall with a heavy clang to the floor, and stepped forward with clinical precision. In one seamless motion he shifted his weight, turned Dorran's shoulder and locked his arm in a tight, immovable grip across his back. Dorran winced, but it wasn't enough to injure, just enough to immobilize. It was restraint without rage, discipline forged by history unknown to anyone on board. "He's hurting me," Dorran yelled, voice rising. "Let go! He attacked me!" The faces in the aisle didn't move. No one stepped forward. They had seen everything, and the silence that met Dorran's cry made his own panic deepen. Senrik released him, stepping back just enough to keep space between them. His attention flicked quickly toward his son. Jaren sat hunched in the seat, curled around Miko like a human shield. The boy was whispering to the trembling puppy, his words lost in a stutter of fear and guilt. "I'm sorry, Miko," Jaren whispered. "I didn't mean, I'm sorry." Senrik dropped to one knee beside his son, placing a firm but gentle hand on the boy's back. "You did nothing wrong," he said quietly, his voice like iron sheathed in warmth. "This ends now." But just as the tension seemed to drop, a shrill beep pierced the cabin. Dorran, having darted back toward the rear service panel, pressed a hidden alarm embedded in the wall. A red light blinked rapidly above the galley. The alert had been triggered. Senrik's head turned sharply. "No," he muttered under his breath. A false emergency had just been broadcast to ground control. Whatever story Dorran told in that alert, violence, assault, passenger disturbance, It was now hurtling down to the tarmac in digital packets. If the flight landed prematurely, it could be Senrik who was taken in first. The lie would arrive before the truth. Dorran straightened, emboldened by the blinking alarm. His breathing was shallow, face flushed. He grabbed me. He assaulted crew, he declared, louder this time, as if saying it first would make it fact. I had no choice but to alert authorities. You had a choice, said a low voice from behind. It was Malrin Thale, the first officer. He stood at the edge of the aisle, one hand braced on the overhead bin, the other at his side. His gaze flicked from Senrik to Dorran, then slowly toward the tray still on the floor. Explain to me, Malrin continued, why that tray was nearly embedded in a passenger's skull. Dorran opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He grabbed me. The dog was out of control. Try again, Malrin said, stepping forward. The authority in his tone made passengers turn. And then, quietly, from 3 rows back, another movement. Edrin Vale, previously silent and unnoticed, lifted his phone subtly. He made brief eye contact with Senrik, just a small nod. A confirmation. The video had already been uploaded to a secure cloud server. Even if devices were seized, the footage lived on. Senrik gave the faintest nod back. His plan to protect the truth was no longer a hope. It had traction now. Dorran, however, was unraveling. He gestured wildly toward the boy. The pet was dangerous. There are policies. He was provoking me. The puppy didn't move, Senrik said, rising to his full height again. His voice was calm, even, but behind his eyes was a growing storm. You provoked yourself. Miko whimpered faintly in Jaren's arms, a sound that cut through the cabin's silence like a blade. It reminded everyone this wasn't theory or policy or posturing. A child's companion had been hurt. Malrin's face hardened. We'll sort this, he said to Senrik before turning to Dorran. But you don't get to decide who's the villain just because you shout loudest. Dorran stepped back, his chest heaving. I've done what I had to. The alert's been sent. When we land, they'll know who you really are. Senrik didn't respond. He just looked to Jaren, whose tear-streaked face was watching him with quiet trust, and then to Miko, who shivered weakly, but was still breathing. He knelt again beside them, placing both hands on the seat frame, like anchoring himself to purpose. You don't get to write this story, he said softly. We do. And somewhere in the cabin's quiet, as passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stand or speak or pray, the weight of the moment thickened. The air wasn't thin because of altitude anymore. It was thin because truth and danger were racing toward the plane, from both the sky and the ground. The truth was recorded, but danger was racing toward the plane from both the sky and the ground. The attendant smirked, sure that no one would challenge him, unaware that every passenger, every camera, and every ounce of the father's restraint was already turning into controlled fury. If you believe abuse under a uniform always folds when power meets purpose, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Captain Relvar Dorn stepped into the aisle with a presence that commanded silence. The hush that followed was immediate, as though the cabin itself recognized a new authority had arrived. His sharp eyes moved from Dorran Kess, rigid and flushed with defensive energy, to Dr. Senrik Hale, who stood near his seat with a steady calm, his son clinging to a trembling puppy. The tension was thick, unspoken, but visible in every clenched jaw and wary glance. What's going on here? Relvar asked, his voice clipped, neutral but unmistakably in control. Dorran straightened like a soldier called to attention. Captain, this passenger assaulted me. His dog attacked. That dog weighs what? 3 pounds? Relvar interrupted without raising his voice, his gaze moving pointedly to the puppy in Jaren's lap. Miko whimpered faintly, the side of his body showing a distinct bruise under the fur. Jaren gently lifted the pup for the captain to see. Relvar's eyes narrowed. You said the dog attacked you, Kess? Dorran faltered, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "Yes, sir. I tripped trying to avoid it, and the passenger became hostile." "No bite marks? No torn fabric?" Relvar asked, scanning Dorran's uniform. It was pressed and clean, unwrinkled. A few passengers stirred, uncomfortable but emboldened. One man cleared his throat. Another woman whispered something to her seatmate. The mood had shifted. Dorran felt it too. Control was slipping, and he reached for it with lies too thin to hold weight. Relvar turned slightly, his attention shifting to the boy. "What happened, son?" Jaren's voice was small, but clear. "He kicked Miko. Twice. I didn't do anything wrong." Senrik stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to anchor his son's words. "Multiple passengers saw what happened. If you need statements, they're ready, including footage." Dorran blanched. Relvar gave a firm nod. "Kess, you're relieved from duty until we land. Return to the rear galley and stay there." The words hit like a verdict. Dorran didn't move. "Captain, you're making a mistake. He's dangerous." "I'll decide what's dangerous," Relvar snapped. Then, more quietly to Senrik, "You said there's footage?" "Yes, recorded, already uploaded to a secure cloud." The captain nodded again, processing. "Good, because ground control was just alerted through an automatic crew escalation trigger. They believe a violent passenger is on board." Senrik's eyes sharpened. "Which means they'll be preparing to detain the wrong person." "Exactly," Relvar muttered. "We need to correct that before we touch down." That's when First Officer Malran Thele emerged again from the cockpit, his expression grim but composed. "If we move now, I can help you reach the forward comm panel. It has a direct override channel to ground control, secure and isolated. We'll have to be quiet about it. Kess still has access to the mid-cabin alarm." Senrik glanced down the aisle. Dorran hadn't retreated. He was still standing near the service station, one hand twitching near the panel, eyes calculating. The moment he noticed movement, he'd sound another alert. Relvar leaned in. "We move during the next round of turbulence. Keep it slow. We can't give him reason to panic further." The air around them felt thin with pressure. Everything, truth, justice, even the boy's safety, now depended on timing, precision, and the will to act under the weight of misjudgment. Senrik looked down at Jaren and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Stay here. Hold Miko. I'll make this right." Jaren nodded, wiping his face, trying to be brave. The boy's courage only deepened Senrik's resolve. Behind them, whispers turned to tension. A few passengers began recording again, subtly, preparing in case things escalated. Malran nodded once, glancing toward the cockpit. "We're entering a light turbulence patch in 60 seconds. That's your window." Senrik inhaled deeply, centering himself. This wasn't just about defending his name anymore. It was about making sure the truth touched the ground before the lie became law. The battle was no longer about the aisle. It had reached the airwaves. Dorran slammed the beverage cart sideways into the aisle with a jarring crash that startled everyone. The metal wheels screeched against the floor, and the jolt sent several drink containers clattering to the ground. The cart wedged diagonally between the seat rows, forming a barrier that trapped half the cabin behind it. Gasps and murmurs broke out as passengers looked around in confusion and alarm. Jaren gripped the edge of his seat, his voice cracking. "Dad, don't go. Please don't leave me." Senrik paused, his eyes locking with his son's, his expression steady but filled with concern. He placed a firm hand on Jaren's shoulder, gently but unshakably. "I'll be right back, I promise," he said, his voice even. Behind them, Miko whimpered again, a soft, pitiful sound that cut through the rising tension. Dorran, flushed and breathing unevenly, stood tall behind the cart, arms outstretched as if daring anyone to challenge his blockade. His eyes darted wildly between passengers, his chest heaving from adrenaline and desperation. He seemed convinced this was his last chance to control the story, to trap the situation in a version that made him the victim. But he had forgotten one simple truth. Everyone had seen too much. Edrin Vale rose slowly from his seat, his camera still dangling from a strap around his neck. His voice didn't shout, but it carried weight. "You hurt a child's dog," he said, his tone measured but firm. "And now you're trying to hide behind panic." The surrounding passengers turned toward him, their faces beginning to shift, from confusion to clarity, from fear to resolve. The confrontation caught Dorran off guard. His mouth opened to retaliate, but words failed him. In that pause, Captain Relvar Dorn and First Officer Malrin Thale pushed forward from behind the cart, finding just enough space to slip through during the distraction. The captain's shoulders were squared, his brow taut with focus. Malrin moved with purpose, tapping a panel key in his hand as they advanced toward the forward comm station. Then the aircraft jolted. A sudden wave of turbulence shook the cabin. Overhead, bins rattled. Some passengers gripped their armrests, others braced against the seatbacks. The lights flickered briefly. Dorran, caught mid-step in the aisle, staggered, one hand grabbing at the beverage cart for balance, but it rolled slightly under his grip, throwing him off. Senric moved. With calm precision, honed by years of mental and physical discipline, he stepped into the narrow gap, seized Dorran's forearm with one hand, and twisted his body with a swift pivot that sent the flight attendant off balance. The passengers held their breath. Senric's grip was not violent, but deliberate, locking Dorran's elbow with enough force to immobilize without injury. His other arm braced Dorran's shoulder, keeping him upright but pinned in place. "Don't move," Senric said quietly, his breath even, his tone devoid of rage, only resolve. Dorran struggled slightly, but the restraint was firm. He wasn't going anywhere. There was a burst of scattered applause from nearby passengers, some out of relief, others simply reacting to justice in motion. But Senric didn't even glance at them. His focus was forward. As the turbulence died down, Malrin reached the forward comm panel, removed the emergency cover, and tapped in a security override code. A panel screen flickered to life, and a small indicator turned green. He looked over his shoulder and gave a tight nod. "Dr. Hale," Malrin said, "it's ready." Senric released Dorran slowly, passing him off to Captain Relvar and a second male crew member who had emerged from the galley. The captain gave him a nod and began escorting Dorran to the rear, speaking low into his radio headset. Jaren peeked over the seat back, his eyes wide, still clinging to Miko. The boy's lip trembled, but the sight of his father standing tall, unharmed and unwavering, seemed to settle something in him. He lowered his head and whispered again to the little puppy, stroking the soft fur behind its ears. Senric stepped toward the panel, standing tall in the narrow space just beside the cockpit door. He took one breath, then another, and placed his hand over the microphone. The hum of the engines was the only sound for a moment. "Velmor SkyFlight 772, Malrin whispered beside him, "has clearance to speak." And Senric began. With the aisle cleared and the truth ready to fly, the final confrontation had only begun. Senric leaned forward, speaking into the secure communication panel with unnerving calm, his voice carrying a quiet precision honed from years of high-level cybersecurity negotiations. "This is Dr. Senric Hale, passenger seat 14C, licensed CTO of Hale Cipher Systems. I am reporting an onboard misconduct incident involving flight attendant Dorran Kess. Multiple passengers witnessed the event. A recording has already been uploaded to a secured cloud link by a fellow passenger. I am prepared to provide verification of my identity and credentials." On the other end, the static-laced response from ground control hesitated. "Please hold. Protocol requires confirmation by crew personnel," the voice replied, clipped and procedural. Senric glanced sideways. First Officer Malrin Thale stood just behind him, his stance firm but composed, arms crossed. Without hesitation, Malrin stepped forward and pressed the override button, leaning into the panel. "This is First Officer Malrin Thale," he announced. "I hereby corroborate the incident. I observed erratic and aggressive behavior from the flight attendant in question. I did not see the initial strike, but the aftermath and testimony from multiple passengers confirm a breach in conduct. I will also be submitting an official log. Please pause any assumptions regarding the alleged violent passenger notice triggered earlier." The communication room on the other end went silent for a few seconds. Too long. Senric's mind moved quickly. If they stalled, if they delayed even slightly, it meant they were recalibrating assumptions they had already acted upon. Meanwhile, back in row 14, Jaren sat hunched over, clutching Miko gently to his chest. The puppy's fur was ruffled and matted near his ribs, where a faint bruise was beginning to show beneath the soft coat. Miko's breathing was shallow but steady. The boy's red eyes shimmered under the overhead light, but he didn't cry anymore. Instead, he watched his father, quietly, almost reverently, as though witnessing something he had only heard about in stories. His fingers traced soft circles against Miko's ear, whispering, "It's okay. We're almost there." The cabin had become a hushed auditorium, every passenger silently following the shift in power. The fear that had filled the air minutes ago had now given way to something else, curiosity mixed with cautious hope, but none of them expected what came next. From the back of the galley, a quiet voice broke the silence. "I saw it happen." Everyone turned. Flight attendant Redden Marr stood near the beverage prep area, hands trembling slightly as he removed his name tag and set it on the tray counter. His voice was soft, but every word landed with force. "I saw Dorran kick the dog. Twice. I didn't speak because I was afraid. We've all seen what happens when someone crosses union boundaries, but I can't stay silent anymore." Senric's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation. That was the tipping point. Captain Relvar Dorn, who had been silently watching the communication unfold, turned slowly. His voice was low but absolute. "That's enough. Kess is suspended effective immediately under my emergency command authority. Crew, isolate him in the rear service station and restrict access until we land." 2 male stewards moved swiftly to carry out the order. Dorran, now pale, deflated, and trembling, was guided away without resistance. The swagger he once carried through the aisle had completely vanished. No arguments, no justifications. Only the dull clink of the service station door as it locked shut behind him. Senric turned from the panel, finally allowing the weight of his mission to ease from his shoulders. But there was no triumph in his expression, only an exhausted, measured resolve. He returned to Jaren's side and knelt slowly, reaching out to touch the back of the boy's hand, still resting gently over Miko. The turbulence had calmed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for descent. Outside, the stars seemed to stretch wider than ever across the sky. "Dad, will Miko be okay?" Jaren asked softly, his voice small but steady. Senric didn't answer right away. He looked into his son's eyes, then at the wounded puppy, and finally at the silent row of passengers who had witnessed something unforgettable. His voice came out low but unwavering. "We'll land soon," he said, brushing his fingers along Miko's fur with gentle reassurance. "And justice is coming with us." The cabin door hissed open with a heavy mechanical clunk, followed by a rush of tempered airport air flooding into the tense silence that had overtaken Velmor SkyFlight 772. The first figures to appear weren't typical airline staff. They were members of the Federal Aviation Response Unit, clad in dark vests with clipped communication radios, flanked by airport enforcement officers with stern expressions and precise movements. Every step they took echoed with purpose. This wasn't a welcome party. It was a retrieval operation. Captain Relvar Dorn had already spoken to them mid-air, his voice calm but clipped with authority as he outlined the incident from cockpit to chaos. What they walked into now was not confusion, but coordination. Passengers, though exhausted, stayed seated as instructed. The atmosphere pulsed with anticipation. Every phone camera tilted subtly toward the aisle. Dorran Kess, once so smug and certain, now stood pale near the galley, his lips slightly parted as though searching for a line to deliver, but none came. His eyes darted wildly, scanning for an ally that no longer existed. He barely had time to react when two officers approached with measured calm. "Mr. Kess," one said firmly, "you're being removed for investigation under Article 8-72 of the Civil Aviation Conduct Code. You will not speak or resist." Dorran opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He froze, almost disbelieving that the very flight he had controlled with fear was now peeling that power from him, strip by strip. They didn't handcuff him yet, but their grip on his elbow was not a suggestion. As they led him down the aisle, some passengers turned away in quiet disgust. Others stared directly at him, their expressions a blend of relief and vindication. Dorran's gaze flicked backward once to where Jaren Hale stood with his son. He saw the boy, Jaren, cradling the trembling but conscious puppy in his arms. He saw Jaren, tall and composed, holding the crate with one hand and guiding his son forward with the other. Their path was clear. His was over. Reporters waited beyond the press line, lenses rising like rifles at a checkpoint. The story had already gone viral. Edrin Vale's upload had reached 100,000 views before the landing gear had even touched the tarmac. Jaren exited the aircraft with poise, ignoring the shouting of journalists until one voice cut through with a question not about the airline, but about fatherhood. "Dr. Hale, what message do you want to send to parents flying with children or pets after this?" Jaren paused. Just 1 second. Then he turned his head, his voice steady and low, yet clear enough to carry. "We don't raise our children to stay silent when someone gets hurt, especially the ones who can't speak for themselves." The cameras clicked like applause. No follow-up question came. There didn't need to be one. Inside the terminal, Senator Grail Morin was already drafting a public inquiry into airline safety standards involving minors and in-cabin animals. The footage from Flight 772 had forced the conversation into the open. By the time Dorran was placed into temporary holding for crew misconduct evaluation, a deeper storm was beginning to swirl around Velmor Airlines. Then, the twist no one expected landed harder than the aircraft itself. A leaked internal memo surfaced on a watchdog blog within hours of the landing. It revealed that Dorran Kess had 2 prior misconduct records, both involving aggression toward vulnerable passengers. Both had been marked as resolved through internal retraining procedures sealed under the Crew Rehabilitation Clause. The revelation ignited public outrage. The airline released a brief, vague statement of regret. But it was too late. The narrative had moved beyond their control. Back in the hotel room that evening, far from flashing cameras and public fury, Jaren sat quietly beside Miko's small crate. The puppy, wrapped in a soft towel, breathed lightly but no longer trembled. Jaren whispered soft stories, nonsense tales about fields and rabbits and safe places, just loud enough for Miko's ears. He didn't understand that his voice had helped spark a national debate. He only knew that his best friend was still breathing, and his father had kept his promise. In a corner chair, Jaren watched the boy, his own body exhausted but his mind still focused. There would be hearings, statements, investigations, but not tonight. Tonight was for rest. Outside the window, lights from Eldoria Port flickered like quiet stars. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the loudest echoes when the world finally listens. The footage had barely finished uploading before the world began watching. Within 48 hours of Flight 772's emergency landing, the cabin incident had spiraled into something far greater than a mid-air altercation. National aviation forums buzzed. Legal analysts dissected frame-by-frame footage on primetime. Hashtags erupted across social media. But in the quiet of a downtown Eldoria law office, Dr. Jaren Hale sat across from 3 federal investigators, the overhead lights cold against the brushed steel table between them. He wasn't angry, not outwardly. His voice was steady as he repeated the timeline for the 3rd time, this time to a different team. He made no demands. He didn't posture. "We're not suing for a payout," he said, locking eyes with the lead investigator, a square-jawed man named Jaren Voss. "We're demanding structural change." Voss blinked, surprised by the clarity. There was no bitterness in Senrik's tone, just purpose. His son's puppy had been kicked in front of a full cabin. The intercom had been used to spin a false report. But this wasn't just about retribution. It was about rewriting the rules that allowed it. Across the city, Velmor Airlines issued a careful, templated statement. Deep regret, internal review, commitment to passenger safety. But none of it landed. Not anymore. The public already had the video. They had Jaren's face, streaked with tears, whispering to his crumpled puppy in that dark cabin aisle. The moment had gone viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. The aviation board convened an emergency session. Subcommittees were formed. What began as a personal injustice had become national scrutiny. Headlines dubbed it the Puppy Protocol Case, a name that grated at Senrik's ears, but one he understood. The symbol mattered. 3 days after the landing, another twist cracked the media cycle wide open. A group of uniformed male pilots and attendants from various airlines released a joint video. Filmed in a single room, each man took a turn reading a short statement. Apologies, acknowledgement, urging reform. "Not all of us would have let that happen," one said, jaw tight, "but too many of us stayed quiet when it did." The video amassed over 10 million views overnight. In their hotel suite, Jaren sat cross-legged beside Miko's recovery crate, drawing silent circles on the side with a dry erase marker. The puppy's breathing was slower now, more even, but a quiet whimper escaped every so often. Jaren leaned forward, whispering. "You're gonna be okay," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Dad's making sure of it." Senrik stood a few feet away, watching his son through the reflection in the hotel window. Behind him, legal advisors waited to discuss the civil filing. Not about damages, about mechanisms, about requirements, about the system. He turned and faced them. "Add this clause," he said. "An independent ethics board must be involved in all escalated in-flight pet incidents. No internal-only reviews, no sealed outcomes." They nodded, typing fast. Elsewhere, hidden behind encrypted servers, whistleblowers emerged, anonymously. One message claimed Dorran Kess had prior complaints, quietly buried under the airline's retraining initiative. Another message revealed crew rosters had loopholes that allowed reprimanded staff to rotate shifts without being flagged. It wasn't just Dorran anymore. A week later, Miko was stable enough to be moved. A specialized veterinary clinic in Eldoria, run by a retired military handler named Dr. Kevin Roll, accepted the case personally. "His chest's bruised," Roll explained, patting the soft blanket where Miko lay. "But he's strong. Gentle, too. That's rare, after trauma." Senrik nodded. "He gets that from my son." Meanwhile, Jaren's quiet resistance became an unexpected voice. His letter to the National Aviation Board, typed slowly, one key at a time on his father's laptop, was short and filled with misspellings. But the heart of it was clear. "Dogs don't talk like people," it read, "but they still feel. If I don't stand up for Miko, who will?" The letter was published by 3 major news outlets and cited in an emergency ethics hearing. At Hale Cipher Systems, Senrik's board of directors offered to delay the company's pending project review. He declined. "My work doesn't stop," he said. "It just got bigger." Within the month, the Civil Aviation Council appointed an independent oversight committee to draft a framework for in-flight animal protection, passenger escalation protocols, and intercom misuse accountability. It was unprecedented. Senric was named civilian advisor to the board, an honorary role, but one with sharp influence. Foreshadowing emerged in the friction it caused behind closed airline doors. Reform meant exposure. Exposure meant pressure. But for Senric, that was the point. In the final hearing of the quarter, the council's chair read a formal directive. Velmor Airlines will be fined under Federal Clause 14A, but more critically required to implement the Passenger Kindness Oversight Framework, effective immediately. Dr. Jaren Hale will serve as liaison advisor. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, but Senric's eyes were on the last paragraph. Not the fine, not the clause. The line that read, "Let this framework ensure that what was done in silence will never remain unseen again." Later that evening, as city lights twinkled through the rain-soaked windows of their hotel suite, Jaren curled beside Miko's crate again. He whispered another story, about stars, about flying without fear, about how good things come back when you take care of them. He didn't know that millions had read his letter. He didn't know that pilots were now being trained differently because of him. He just knew his puppy was breathing, and that his father hadn't let the world ignore it. In every dark cabin where injustice hides, let this be the light that finds it. The moment Dr. Jaren Hale stepped onto the stage at the National Aviation Ethics Forum, the room fell into a profound hush. There was no preamble, no music, no host with a scripted introduction. Just Senric, tall, steady, and silent, walking forward with a custom-designed comfort carrier strapped across his chest. Inside it, nestled with calm dignity, rested Miko, the small brown puppy who had once been kicked mid-flight by a man who thought no one would care. The symbol on the side of the carrier gleamed under the spotlight, a silver emblem of the newly ratified Passenger Kindness Act, a sweeping aviation reform born from that incident on Velmor SkyFlight 772. Every eye in the chamber, aviation executives, regulatory officials, pilots, attendants, passengers who had written in, even student volunteers, was fixed on the man who had once chosen quiet protection over violent retaliation, and whose restraint had reshaped federal policy. In the front row sat 14-year-old Jaren Hale, spine straight, hands gently gripping the handle of the same crate Miko had flown in. The crate was polished but unmodified, its scrapes and dents left intact as deliberate reminders of what had happened. He wore a navy suit that still hung slightly loose on his growing frame, but the way he held himself had changed. He was no longer the trembling boy gripping his puppy after an assault. He was the son of a man who had defended without cruelty, and whose dignity had changed an industry. Senric stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone. His eyes swept the audience, not as a showman, but as a man who had witnessed something break and had chosen to build instead of destroy. "This was never just about a puppy," he began. His voice was steady, but it carried a depth that silenced even the coughs in the back rows. "This was about how we treat those who can't defend themselves, the ones we think no one will stand up for." He paused, letting the words breathe. The auditorium remained silent. Miko didn't bite anyone. He didn't bark constantly. He didn't misbehave. But he was punished for existing in a space where someone decided he didn't belong. And my son was told, through silence and indifference, that protecting something gentle was a nuisance. His hand, still resting near Miko's carrier, curled slightly at the edge of the podium. "I stood up that day not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I refused to teach my son that silence is ever the right answer when cruelty is at play." Jaren's eyes brimmed slightly, but he didn't blink. He held his crate tighter. "In the months since, I've been called a hero. I'm not. I'm a father. I'm a man who had the privilege and the pain of seeing exactly how broken a system can be when silence is rewarded and accountability is optional." A long beat passed before he continued, his voice growing firmer. We pass regulations and issue statements, but it starts here: how we train our crews, how we listen to our passengers, how we admit when something went wrong without rushing to cover it up. If the smallest creature on a flight can be kicked without consequence, then how safe are we, really? A quiet murmur moved through the back of the auditorium. He had struck something deep. Flight 772 didn't just carry passengers that day. It carried assumptions. It carried fear. It carried a man who believed his title gave him power, and a boy who thought he was powerless. Both were wrong, and that's why we're here. The screen behind him lit up with a photo, Jaren cradling Miko just moments after landing, captured from a bystander's video that had gone viral. We don't raise our children to stay silent when someone gets hurt, especially the ones who can't speak for themselves. Applause erupted, not the routine clapping of polite conferences, but the kind that came in waves, rising, breaking, returning again as if the room itself needed to exhale after holding its breath for too long. After the speech, Senrik stepped down from the podium as quietly as he had arrived. He walked with Miko past a row of airline CEOs, legislators, and military liaisons, none of whom looked away. Every camera followed him, but he didn't acknowledge them. He simply made his way toward Gate 17A at Eldoria Port, now no longer just a gate, but a monument. A bronze plaque had been installed beside the entryway. As Senrik approached, Jaren joined him, still holding the old crate. Together, they stood before the engraving, which read, "Let no voice be silenced, no creature harmed, and no passenger shamed for protecting the gentle." The story could have ended there, but it didn't. Behind the scenes, Dorran Kess, once confident and untouchable, had been banned permanently from any position in the aviation industry. Legal proceedings were still underway, not only for the assault but for falsifying safety reports and triggering a false cabin emergency. His name, once associated with seniority and procedure, was now a warning in every airline ethics seminar. Jaren, once shy and withdrawn, began receiving invitations to speak at schools, not as a victim, but as a young man who stood firm when it mattered. He never tried to become famous, but his voice, filled with compassion and clarity, made its way into classrooms where students, like him, learned that courage didn't always roar. It sometimes cried while holding a small dog and still refused to back down. As for Senrik, he returned to his cybersecurity work, rebuilding firewalls, writing protocols, analyzing vulnerabilities. But his name would never again be just another line in a tech contract. It would remain etched in the regulations of an industry, in the training guides handed to new flight attendants, in the quiet bravery that passed through every passenger who now knew the story of SkyFlight 772. The flight may have ended, but its impact will echo for generations. Seconds later, the father rose, his presence alone freezing the entire crew. The attendant's arrogance evaporated, the cabin went silent, and the airline's fate flipped in an instant. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, disclaimer, the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of vigilance and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family and pet with dignity and respect.